today is March 10th. And on March 7th, something happened that we probably missed considering there's chaos going on in the Middle East, right? So on March 7th, at the golf course in Miami on Mar a Lago, they had a meeting. Um, let's talk about who was there. Let's talk about what this meeting was about, right? So in the room, in this meeting, you could find the who's who of who. Uh, Christy Knowles was there. Pete Hegseth was there. Um, Marco Rubio was there. The Secretary of the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, which is the first time I've heard that name, was also there. Howard Lutnick. They were all in this room having a conversation about, wow, the shield of the Americas. How do you like that? So, who was in the room in the Shield of the Americas? We touched about that, right? The map of the Americas titled the Shield of Americas. Um, this meeting was kind of odd. And as we get through a little bit more information, we'll see. On March 7th of 2026, Donald Trump hosted a summit at his own golf resort in Doral, Florida. He called it the Shield of Americas. He signed a proclamation. He posed a photo. He talked about missiles. But who were the people standing next to him? Because that matters a lot. Tonight, we're going to go one by one. Who attended the summit, their countries, their records, questions, research, human rights organizations, and their own citizens are asking about them. So, first, first is first, right? The Shield of America, also called the America Contra Counter Cartel Coalition, is a multinational military cooperation initiative established by Trump to coordinate military and security efforts among participating nations to combat the transnational criminal organization, particularly drug cartels. Yep. Trump was joined at the summit by the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, and Kristi Noem, who was just removed from GHS Secretary and named Special Envoy for the initiative. What is that? Okay. So, public reporting suggests that the conference also sought to build more of a robust counter China safety region in line with what Trump administration calls the Trump culinary corollary. Sorry about that. Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. So, who signed on and who didn't sign on, right? So, Nayeli Bukele from El Salvador, the most internationally recognized face at the summit, is probably um it's insane that he's there. It says a lot. Bukele has been called the world's coolest dictator by himself. He posted it on X. He meant it as a joke, but researchers aren't laughing. Nobody's laughing. Bukele has been called one of the world's coolest dictators, right? In August of 2025, El Salvador legislator voted to abolish the presidential term limits, essentially giving Bukele the right to rule indefinitely. According to the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, El Salvador is now experiencing the fastest rate of democratic backsliding of any country in Latin America. Yep, El Salvador now has the highest incarceration rate per capita in the world, with over 80,000 people imprisoned under the state of exemption declared in March of 2022. A state has procured mass detentions, arrests without warrants, trials without due process, and repression of journalists and human rights defenders. Bukele has dismantled democratic institutions through judicial systems, constitutional manipulation, and severe civil society restrictions, and his authoritarian model is being exported through controversial agreements with the Trump and House U.S. deportees in El Salvador, most notorious mega prison. Now, this story comes from NPR News, Mexico Daily, and ABC News. Now, we could sit here and say, oh, how boring. But the American Shield is something really interesting because we need to talk about how these people have been put in place, but there is a couple of people missing, a couple of countries that are not included in this coalition to supposedly combat um, trafficking of drugs. So, how can you do the job if you don't have everyone there and you decide not to invite them? Yeah. So, let's go to Malay, okay, in Argentina. Then there's Javier Milei, the self destructive anchor capitalist who came to power in December of 2023, brand sliding a literal chainsaw as a symbol of cutting the government. Well, yeah, he cut the government and then he asked for the United States for a handout, right? 40 billion of your dollars, or was it 40 million? I think it was $40 million of our tax-paying dollars. So yeah, that's fucking crazy. A study by Argentina think tank Asuntos del Sur, grounded in the framework for the book How Democracies Die, found that Malay's first year in office showed clear markets of authoritarian risk, including the denial of legitimacy of political opponents, frames the entire sector of societies as criminals, communists, and enemies. So you could sit here and say it's boring, but you don't have to stay, right? Although Argentina's president enjoys legitimacy, separation of powers, remains functional, analysts say the government's policies exhibit an authoritarian spirit that threatens democracies advanced over 40 years. Sounds familiar? It's happening here. Malay shut down the Ministry of Women, a Gender and Diversity and National Institute Against Discrimination, framing the LGBTQ and minority protections as ideological excesses rather than democratic safeguards. In January of 2026, Milei issued a sweeping emergency decree to restructure Argentina's intelligence agency, massively expanding its surveillance powers and placing it under control of his sister, Karina Milei, who serves as his chief of staff. So, if you don't call this overreach, what do you call overreach? And do you like to be surveyed? Do you like surveillance everywhere? Block cameras at every corner? Because it's happening and you may not be aware of it. Let's talk about Daniel Nova in Ecuador because he was at this meeting as well. Daniel Nova is one of the youngest leaders at the summit. He has spent much of his mandate attempting to open Ecuador to foreign military bases, which is prohibited under the country's 2008 constitution. His administration launched a joint military operation with the United States. The week before the summit, Ecuador and the U.S. conducted what the U.S. Southern Command describes as lethal kinetic operation against designated terrorist organizations within Ecuador. The significant escalation of U.S. military involvement in Latin America, domestic security. This is wild, guys. Nova won power on security platforms following one of Ecuador's worst periods of cartel violence. Critics raise constitutional concerns about his government style. Supporters say he's doing what others wouldn't do. Where do you sign off and say that you're willing to lose your freedom, like we did with the Patriots Act? I mean, we should be an example to everyone across the world. That wasn't the right move for us. This is where we're at today. Let's talk about Panama. Panama's Molino came into power in 2024. His biggest international profile moment came when Trump pressured Panama to withdraw from Chile's Belt and Road Initiative and review Chinese controls and key port facilities. Trump has made countering Chinese influence in the hemisphere top priority, and Panama, which controls one of the world's most strategic waterways, became the center of the strategy. Molino's critical inside. Panama raised concerns about his ties to former President Ricardo Martinelli, who was convicted of corruption. He is not widely criticized authoritarian. His government raises transparency questions. Let's go to Paraguay. Another one, right? Paraguay, Santiago Peña, represents one of the longest ruling political parties in the world. The Colorado Party, which has governed Paraguay for most of the 75 years, including through 35 years of dictatorship under Alfredo Stroessner. Peña himself is not an accused dictatorship, but Paraguay consists of ranks among the most corrupt countries in South America. And the Colorado Party grip on the power raises structural concerns about genuine political competition. Bolivia. Bolivia's new president, Rodrigo Paz Perea, who took office in late 2025, attended as a newly inaugurated conservative leader. He represents a sharp rightward shift from government of Luis Acre, the agency of Evo Morales. His administration is new enough that there is limited track record, but his ideology alignment with Trump and Milei is what secured his invitation. Honduras. This is one of the most controversial attendees. Trump gave his unconditional support in Honduras' recent contested elections, but then refused to maintain protected immigration status to Honduran migrants in the United States. The election that brought Asfuda to power were disputed, and his predecessor, Castro, was the first woman elected as president in Honduras. The transition of power itself has been politically contentious. The U.S. preference for ideology alignments over electoral legitimacy is questioned. Let's go to the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic is one of the most conventionally democratic leaders at the summit. He was previously set to host the 10th Summit of the Americas until it fell apart. Pressured by the White House, had barred Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela from attending. When leftist leaders from Colombia, Mexico threatened to pull out in protest, and with no commitment from Trump to attend, they canceled the event, citing deep differences in the region. His attendance here reflects a pragmatic alignment with Washington rather than an ideological transformation. Costa Rica. Costa Rica is one of Latin America's oldest and most stable democracies, but Chavez himself is a controversial figure within it. He has been known for attacking the press, clashing with his own legislator, using executive powers aggressively. The country has strong democratic institutions. Whether Chavez respects him is a separate question domestic observers debate. Chile. Chile's attendance is notable. It was Chile's presidential elect, Jose Antonio Cast, who attended not sitting government cast of the March 11th of 2026. The cast is hard right political, whose father was a Nazi immigrant to Chile and who has expressed nostalgic for aspects of the Pinochet era, one of the most brutal dictatorships in Latin America's history. He was elected in a democratic process, but his ideological position, particularly on immigration and security, aligned closely with Trump and the administration's worldwide view. You can't stand who was in the room without understanding who wasn't. The leftist leaders of three Latin America biggest economies were not there. Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia were not invited. A former Clinton National Council official who helped plan and organize the 1994 summit of the Americas described the contrast this way. The first summit of 34 nations projected inclusion, consensus, optimists. The shield of the Americas, he said, conjured a crushed defensive with only a dozen or so attendees huddled around a single dominant figure. The three absent countries, Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia, represent more than half of the region's GDP. They also hold the largest portion of the region's illicit markets, including narc production and trade, and supposed target of the summit. So the question worth asking is, can a coalition to fight cartels work without the countries where the cartels are most active? Here's why the conversation matters to communities. The US just formalized military partnership with countries that are housing American deportees, conducting joint lethal military operations, and in some cases, rolling back the rights of their own people. Analysts warn that relying on ideology alignment between individual leaders, particularly in democratic societies where political winds will eventually shift, risk, undermine, and development of long term bilateral relationships could generate backlash, similar to the anti imperialist movement that emerged from the US Cold War interventions in Latin America. The people most affected of these policies are migrants, families separated by detention, communities in countries under these agreements are often the same communities watching this live stream right now. The leaders at the summit made decisions at Doran, Florida that will play out in El Salvador's prisons, Ecuador streets, Honduras politics, and immigration courts right here in the United States. Knowing who was in that room is the first step. That's the breakdown. 12 countries, one coalition, and a lot of questions that aren't getting asked from Main Street coverage. What do y'all think about this? This is crazy. But I wanted to bring this out to the light so people could hear it and listen to it. There is a lot going on. If you want to read into this article, you can find it on NPR News, ABC News, and Mexico Daily.